Hello everyone, today we talk about Arnold of Brescia and the ideal of a poor church. So in last weeks we have revived a little bit the topic of the Pauperistic evangelical movements. We've seen a bit more in detail the story of Peter Waldo, the Waldensians. Now we talk about this character that is relatively, less important on a scale, but only by few, and that actually is deeply overlooked in this regard. In order to understand the internal troubles that the church had in actually keeping together the consensus of around the work of restructuring that it was carrying out essentially between the end of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th century. So we'll just enter into this context. We have, if you go in the medieval Christianity playlist, you'll find plenty of videos on the Gregorian reforms, so I won't be repeating myself, but you know that there was this tone of restoration of the church, from which the same new order of the church after the Gregorian reforms was based, and it can be interpreted as having a double matrix, right? From one side, there was the stemming of the interference of the laymen in matters that pertained to the priestly functions, right? From the other side, it was rehabilitated the episcopal role as the unique, legitimate instrument of intervention within the clergy itself and of its faults, fundamentally. So there was the reinforcements, essentially, of the ecclesiastical structures as the only element that could essentially regulate the same church. And this naturally entailed the same concept with papal monarchy that embodied the same hierarchy in itself. The Roman Church managing effectively at this point to be not just to be recognized, but to effectively structure the same ecclesiastical organization in the West in a way that previously had not existed, right? By certain standards, as a monarchy, as a monarchic system proper had never been conceived. It's important that we talk about bishops, because the bishops were theoretically all equal in the early Christianity. So there were naturally certain, different status related to the primacy of charity, for example, of the Roman Church, but theoretically the assembly of bishops, the ecumenic council, was theoretically superior to every bishop, including the Roman one or the other metropolitic ones. As we know, for reasons that we have already explained in the past videos, this thing had changed, and there's a lot of continuity, naturally, of also with movements and currents and ideals, as we'll see now, that had already started before this, and that the church now used, the Roman Church specifically, used to reinforce actually its own autonomy from secular authorities, and at the same time to actually stratify essentially the ecclesiastical hierarchy. So even in substitution of the monks, for example, and in the care of the souls, that was urged by the non-fulfillment of the secular clergy, the church intervened, quite resizing essentially the importance that certain currents within, for example, coming from monasticism, had, right? The church wanted to reaffirm its own administration, its own jurisdiction, telling the truth. So keeping out those experiences that, especially in this time, were raising pretty fast as kind of systems within the same church, sometimes abroad, far away from Rome. Think about the various Benedictine reforms that brought to the creation of these orders, that, however, being tied with the elites, and at the same time being not so radical, as a matter of fact, in the once they achieved their own structuration, decided to bond with the church, right? But there were other fringes of, especially of monastic elements, that lesser monastic elements that had kind of different tensions and views, and this in fact would bring to it had actually contributed to the same creation of the Gregorian reforms. The Gregorian reforms owed much to the local Italic, especially Tuscan monasticism of kind of that was embodied by certain radical and intransigent currents that were fed up with the imperial intervention in churchly affairs. So the same reform of the church had been born with that spirit, right? But when you have to give a structure to an actual system that stretches all over, Western Europe, and that controls huge amounts of lands and properties, and you need to control this, you can't think just through ideals. You have naturally to stick to this philosophy, because it has to be grounded even legally on the prerogatives that you're claiming, right? And it has to have a spirit on its own. But at the same time, this is an aspect that I stress a lot in Schwerpunkt, because I actually believe in it, like as a matter of strengthening of certain means of control that can't be seen as like this. Oh, this system was so oppressive, right? It was all about corruption and increasing more power. Yeah, because what did every other single community out there, lay and ecclesiastical alike, in Christianity as well, I don't know, as in Islam, but also in other times and religion, actually did, right? And we often forget this, because naturally the history of the 12th century especially is a history of repression. In many ways it is, but it also this repression must be understood under the light of course, private, let's say, personal interests from one side, but actually the fact that this system was really developing as the church proper. I mean, the idea that this was not a person. I mean, popes didn't reign for very long. They were elected. Entire political directions could be changed, but objectively the church maintained its unity in this regard, and it did so because it had an effective role in the society, in the politics of the time, that can't be dealt just as this was a kind of an extraneous body that developed in an anomalous form, and then they got to even repress and to, first of all, the elites, as we've seen, also the lay elites by certain standards were kept always together with the church. Like even the struggle, the investiture controversy always contemplated the cooperation between the empire and the papacy. Like it was unconceivable anything different from that. And these two powers actually did their own share of good, after all, in keeping Christian society orderly. In ways that maybe, they're not, I'm not sure how much these things have been said. This could be a very interesting topic for, a PhD or some other research of the actual work of pacification, for example, that the church carried out at one point. Many people would say, well, but weren't these the same guys who launched crusades, against the Near East, in the Baltic, against Cathars, etc. Well, but have you ever wondered in that regard, especially internally speaking, thinking about the Cathars, what was the general deal there? I mean, we never actually talked very much in detail about the Cathars proper, and I'm the first person who realizes that Cathars are basically did never exist as such. I mean, it was definitely still a papal construction to legitimize, to authorize legally did the same crusade in southern France, but these were movements that were actually really pushing towards the disgregation of certain unities, and lots of the same. We have seen it with the same Valdensians in the video we made recently, that might having of course contrasts with the Church of Rome. They always offered, for example, the support against the Cathars themselves. So even these fringes that were repressed, and they were repressed for a reason, because they did have kind of extremistic instances, radical instances. And the fact that they were Christian, it has nothing to do in this world, because this entire world was Christian. So we don't have to be surprised about it. Of course, we can't. We have to give the strictly religious and sometimes even doctrinal manner of the story its due. But there were massive political and social implications in this that you can't deal as if, these people were killed or repressed because they thought something else, right? This is partly true, but the problem was much larger, and it entailed indeed an attack to the same constituted order and establishment. But the question at that point, these guys lost, and that's a pretty powerful indicator, especially in this time in history where, politically speaking, we're talking about a very fragmented scenario. Why in this mess actually these things were repressed basically everywhere and successfully, and why they didn't manage to obtain something. And this is something you have to think about, because we think history is written essentially by winners, but it's not the case. That's actually one of the most false statements you can make about history. Here, what you have to look is why these systems failed, and the easy answer that is not necessarily maybe the most complete, but it definitely has its own importance, is that these movements didn't have any actual constructive plan about what they would have to do. They were essentially Protestant movements in the sense of they were forever protesting. How many groups in society are forever protesting, right? And how many of them statistically are normally kind of extremistic, like the minority, but these minorities were in fact present, Europe-wide at that point, and in fact just a tiny part of them was actually repressed. Others were integrated successfully in the church. And another aspect we have to realize, and that we have kind of, even as in the modern age, misconceived because of the part of the great schism, of the Reformation, and also of certain nationalistic and rationalistic instances that have been taken, for example, towards the church, is that when we look at this 12th century, let's call them heretic without any negative exception, is that they were essentially heroes of free will, free thought, and against the terrible obscurantism and oppression. Absolutely no. These people actually owned usually even more radical views than what the mainstream ecclesiastical elites had, which was not radical at all in the sense that, of course, the Gregorian reform had brought on the table this completely new concept and enacted it effectively, but they were not extremistic in the sense that they didn't call for the disruption of civil order, for example, or of associated, normal associated form of, the elimination of property, of things like this, because these things, if you look at history, have always happened over and over and over again. They keep happening. How many people want to abolish property today, and how many people rightfully think they're nuts, right? And that's the problem. Maybe, I don't know, we will arrive to one point in history in which property will be, eliminated simply because maybe we'll have means to manage it so easily that will not matter at any point. But in this point in history, just like today, you can't objectively look at these instances and say, this is actually a healthy way of looking at what we have to do. This naturally brought down, there were abuses, massacres, we don't have to close our eyes in front of what the church actually did at that point, but we also have to observe that it was exactly what every other single polity out there of any religion, of every status, actually did. And what we're doing was actually nothing new, nothing so strange, right? And it was something that, especially if you concentrate on the actual context, you'll see as pretty concretely motivated, right? Maybe we don't justify it today because it would be inconceivable morally, but at the time think this at the time, which doesn't mean that we're doing well, even for those time standards in general, but what were the standards in general of action at the time? That's what you should wonder. And in parallel, you should observe instead what also the church did do of positive, including stopping wars, trying to arrive to peaceful negotiations, to stabilize certain areas, because this is what they did too. And the secular elites were doing essentially the same thing as well, because at the end of the day, that's what you want. You want to pacify the world. You don't want instability. The greatest powers, so in theoretically the most oppressive ones, are also the ones that want regularly society, economy to be healthy, because they can make money from that. And if you destroy society, that doesn't work quite well. And these guys were criticizing the very base of the very foundations of legal, property, and of the establishments of the elites, etc. And of course, it was just a minority that caused trouble, but this trouble was consistent enough to create schisms, and which eventually didn't happen. That's why before I said, think of what actually happened eventually, because that's a pretty good thermometer to see in the absence of certainties, because objectively we know very few still about this time. The 12th century is still a very primitive time if you think about it, very different from the following, from the 13th, for example. But think at what concretely this meant. So there was an impulse that was given to the forms of common life of the clergy at this point, and especially the establishment, the institution of a body of regular canons that had principally to absolve to this need, which was essentially to mutuate from those, essentially monastic environments, the moral characteristics required to the administrators of the sacred, of the holy. Right? This was an important aspect of the story, because objectively the Gregorian reforms had been backed powerfully by the same movements. The Pauperistic evangelical movements weren't absolutely, like someone would like to see them, like a criticism to the foundations of the establishment. The Pauperistic evangelic movements were some of the most radically trusters and believers in the Roman Church. The Pauperistic evangelical movements are the ones that backed powerfully the Roman Church at all times, because they were convinced that one pure pope would be elected, and that was the rightful authority. Right? They could criticize the person that sat on Peter's chair, but they didn't criticize Peter's chair as such. Right? So that's also where it gets actually controversial, because actually, certain movements didn't have just a strictly doctrinal or religious demand. They simply believed that there was a moment in which even the written form was still spreading. I mean, we don't even know clearly what the instances of these groups actually were, and we can't think that it was just a spiritual tension, that most of these people didn't know what even Rome was. I mean, of course, many of them would go in pilgrimage in the holy places and so on, but it was, once again, this is 12th century Europe. You don't actually know scientifically the world you live in. You essentially have in mind the existence of these authorities. You think that that's what the whole world is about, fundamentally, especially for your conscience, your spirituality, your afterlife, or your true life after death, and that's all you care about. So the popes had extremely carefully, first of all, exploited the movements such as the Pataria, for example. I made a video on that. Search at Schwerpunkt Pataria, you will find it immediately. They had used those to actually counter even certain political currents within the clergy that at the beginning didn't absolutely want the Roman papacy taking over essentially the ecclesiastical hierarchies, right? So actually the Gregorian reforms had this great spiritual momentum that was deeply felt by the Western Church, that objectively allowed the same Roman monarchy to emerge from the Church. of course, implicitly to this was the need of an order and of an authority as well. So we can't even claim properly, as we were saying before, that these movements actually directly claimed the absence of a structure, of a hierarchy. But even the ways in which this had to be carried out eventually had disappointed many. Because objectively, the church structured itself even more as a signory, as a principate, and having its own, its own palaces, its own treasuries, its own armies, its own lands and peasants. That was the Roman Church had become. The Roman Papacy at this point starts having an enormous power. Right? It had always had it, but now it's expanding far and wide throughout all Europe, throughout the ecclesiastical channels, right? And the thing is complicated. There is an enormous literature about this. Now we don't have the time to discuss it, but it's important to frame this context before talking even of figures like Arnold of Brescia, right? And as a consequence, first of all, the episcopate was ever more directly controlled by Rome, that in turn was stimulated herself to control that the administrative and religious functions of the dioceses were carried out correctly, right? And this is also part of the positive aspect of the story, like the detachment, let's say, the clearance, the purification, as they would have thought, of the episcopal elites of the dioceses by local lay interference was a big deal. Well, it was actually for making the church functioning better, right? This whole thing surely brought overall to less corruption in the measure, the laymen could influence the orientation of the church itself. Always bearing in mind that every single political and social system at the time is corrupt by definition, because there is no alternative of any sort in a pre-centralized state situation. These societies worked exclusively thanks to corruption, because there was no other way but clientelism to make things work effectively, right? So corruption, like, claiming for corruption, moral corruption for the 12th century. What the hell do you know? What do you think that world was actually about? Because that's also a problem. There are lots of judges and a lot of people who make this kind of judgments today, and these are things that are echoing essentially, reforming positions, either from the Protestants or the Catholics. Like, there is no historical, objectivity in attributing these things to the church or whichever power at the time, by claiming that this was more or less, morally fit than others. The whole world worked exclusively through that form. Exclusively. Aside from this, the entire institutional organization of the church underwent a process of redefinition and formalization that passed through, in fact, certain indicators of what it's really needed to make the systems function. This is evident, for example, in the codification of canonic law by the work of Gratian, the Decretum Gratiani. Famously, we will talk about this in History of Medieval Law. So this is really the picture of what the church was doing proper. So it's within this frame that the defeat of the aspirations to poverty and evangelic simplicity were matured, right? So that many of those who had hoped in the reformation of the clergy and society as a whole were disappointed. Like, it's obvious that the church was beginning, in the name of its own libertas, of its own liberty, its own freedom, actually, within its boundaries, especially towards from secular power, would make it affirm the right to be rich and powerful, right? And if you're not rich and powerful, you don't organize a good nothing. If you study the history of paparistic evangelical movements, they failed largely because they were poor and weak. Why do you think things fail, historically speaking? Because they're not backed, they're not supported, they're not powerful enough. You need a lot of resources to make things work and to make them be successful, otherwise they fail, right? And that's why they failed, even though they were actually pretty big movements, pretty large movements. Naturally, the picture is complicated, but even these instances, think about the poorest strata of the populations that usually actually at this time didn't change a great deal, because these ideas were spreading mostly throughout the middle classes, but objectively those would have hoped maybe for a more equal society, economically speaking, where actually the enormous amount of poor people that existed at the time, and they didn't change a big deal, right? And also society wasn't actually about even the poor had their own organizations, they had their own power, they had their own communities, and there was a fragmentation in this picture as well. The peasantry didn't have at all a class conscience, but it could have not existed. Like, it's not that someone was preventing them from having one, it's just that they couldn't have it, because for those times standards of economics, of surplus, of connection, of communication, they simply couldn't have it. Especially at this point in the 12th century, where they were actually still a thing. Like, the peasantry was something also extremely aggressive and dynamic in many ways. So, in the interesting aspect of the story is that, in fact, even monarchism adapted to this dynamic. The originary character of rigid collective poverty that had characterized the Cluniac movement, for example, had rapidly dissolved in this unstoppable process of enrichment of the reformed monasteries. You give this monasteries land and power, and people will come to work there and bring their the livestock they start building, they start producing, they start manufacturing. This becomes a business, and it's normal, it's fine. This thing helped terribly the people who lived, who worked in these lands. And this was a positive thing, right? But it's obvious at that point you can't preach for actually a poor life, a poor custom. I mean, you could do that, but you should take it a bit more philosophically. And in my opinion, even if you read the scriptures, essentially, it's, okay, let's not say more, but let's say that everything is very interpretable in this regard as well. I mean, what is poverty? There's a highly metaphorical concept here. It's about not being essentially distracted by things that have not to do with your soul and your existence, but it's obvious that you do live in the world. It's obvious that you have to live in a certain way. You can't take it radically, otherwise the whole society would collapse in some ways. And actually Christianity is aware of this, and that's why it's so subtly, pragmatic in my opinion, but enigmatic, and it doesn't quite define, because you're always the one that should search for the answer in every moment. That's why I say that those movements, in their at least more violent fringes, were very extremistic, because objectively they were claiming something that was just a radical interpretation of the scriptures in many ways. And even if you look at those new orders that had been created, had been formed autonomously between the end of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th century on the base of a fundamentally pauperistic choice, they had rapidly to follow this parabola of addiction, let's say, to the property logic, because how do you eat? Right, especially when you start being a lot of people, because that's also how, during the early modern age, poverty was essentially taken away. Like, it was, poor people were enclosed in certain hostels. They were, essentially segregated, right? During the Middle Ages, it wasn't like that. In the Middle Ages, the poor was a normal figure around. It was full of poor people, of beggars, of people, were crippled, they couldn't work, they Those were brutal wars. Think about illnesses that left you incapacitated. It was normal in that world, that there was the poor among the others, right? But what was starting to happen in the 12th century is that population increased, and these economical unbalances were taking place ever more frequently. Wars increased, and this basically created waves of systematic waves of, let's say, of failures substantially in society. Think about famines that were somewhat cyclical in some way. So every once in a while there were waves of these movements that you have to understand, even under the light of socio-economical dynamics, not just what these people actually believed in Christian terms, because once again, these were all Christians, right? Aside from the fact they actually understood anything about theology, which was not the case most of the times, but that's what you were. You're born in 12th century, you're Christian, point, end of the story. There is no other way, like nobody enforces it to you. You're Christian by definition, you don't even pose yourself the problem of it. In fact, all this dissent was not by atheists. These people believed, they all believed, especially lower strata of the population. Atheists could be more frequently among bishops or cardinals than among the pauperistic movements, right? And even there, there's a huge debate, because now it's become somewhat fashionable to think that every person who had, a scientific interest was a hidden atheist in a society of Christians who would have burned him otherwise. No, really not. You can't, that has nothing to do with whether you're Christian or not. These people were all Christians. And there was no way to even, there was no need to be something else, right? What's the point of being something else? What for? What's the advantage? What's the interest? What's your, you need to be comforted. Now, we've never entered in the psychology of these phenomena, but believe me, we do know, but comparatively, that it's extremely easy to fit in this system, right? And it doesn't mean that you're not committed. These people truly believed in it. That's why I don't like when these stories are told like, these guys were just about money and power, and they didn't care about God. They cared actually about both things, like we all do in terms of what we believe in, deeply, spiritually, or whatever, and what we care in real life. The two things do not exclude each other, and it's radical, in fact, to pretend to do it, which is what these fringes were trying to do, essentially saying, we should all get rid of property. The question is, what for? To make civilization crumble, to make people starving en masse to death? What for, objectively? There is no way out of this, right? And civilization passed through, money. Like, you can't think of the Renaissance if you don't think about the banks. You can't think of all of the medieval civilization. You don't think about trade, traffics. But the really is okay. Well, maybe we'll talk about this more another time. But always connect these factors, because they're never detached, right? Even if for didactic purposes now, here we talk about a history of the church. Okay, well, religious history. Okay, then we talk about history of economics. But they're the same thing. They're the same thing. They comfort each other. And you must understand it if you want to get to the point here, right? Now, so, for example, the order of Citeaux that had developed against the reforming impulse of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, that we have discussed also recently, in his, chiefly from history of art, of philosophy, say of the architectural aesthetics, etc. But that entailed, in fact, even if you look at that video, that there is a systematization of spaces that was functional even for working. At the mid-12th century, the order of Citeaux would have actually forgotten in part the norms that the same Saint Bernard had fixed at that point. So it's if you want, and that's how you should see it, in my opinion, this is a phase of normalization of certain tendencies that emerging in the context of a theological ever more vivacious theological debate were fueling, let's say, certain criticism that were actually of new character, of new brand, we can say, and that were founded, and this is very interesting as well, on a rationalistic reading of the scriptures and of the fathers of the church. And a similar approach implied the development of the instruments of logics that would have reached, in fact, its highest moment in the maturity of scholastics, but that already in this decades between the end of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th century found this exceptional interpreter in Abelard, right? And this intellectual ferment spread essentially in the most advanced environments of the ecclesiastical thought, right? This is also another thing you have to take into account, as always. It's not poor people who make revolutions, it's ideologues who move the masses, they lead the masses, and improvements are done always at the top of society. And then they pass down, right? Because the others have no awareness of this. And so this is how it happened. It passed from the ecclesiastical elites that were essentially opening their own horizons. Now we don't have time to explain all the intellectual achievements that were taking place in this thing, but Europe was really rocketing pretty fast in that regard. It was an enormous interest that we have deeply overlooked. Even before the so-called 12th century Renaissance, right? That was amazing, and it started even actually from middle classes, spontaneously, at least in the most in the richest and most advanced areas in Europe. But it was massively, like, it was open to all this literature that was pouring from Muslim Spain into Christendom, and there was an enormous work of translation, and we made a lot of videos actually about that too, and so on. And we could say that this thinking began to take root in this still vital and ground of religious dissent that existed, and producing this singular phenomena, such as finally this movement of rebellion headed by Arnold of Brescia against ecclesiastical property, in a I would say late revival of what had been the Patarian movements of the let's say time of full restoration of post-Gregorian character, right? The same Gregorian reform, actually, as we've said before, had backed the same movements before, but now they had to frame them, had to control them to stem their influence. So what about Arnold? So he was born in Brescia, in northern Italy, in Lombardy, at the end of the 11th century. And he had been around 1115 a very careful listener of the lessons of Abelard in Paris, right? So it was normal. Paris, as we know, this was the moment of development of university. We have made the other day just a video about the birth of medieval universities. We've seen that Bologna was all about law, Paris was all about theology. Paris was the largest center of theological studies in Europe, and it was also, in fact, overflowed, and this is what eventually triggered scholastics by papal direction, by works that arrived from very, very far. Aristotle began to spread basically at this point in an uncontrolled form, because the church had initially forbade to study Aristotle before scholastics eventually decided to integrate it, managed to integrate it, because they had given up to stem it. And with Abelard, Arnold maintained contacts also in the later decades. This is a circumstance that has brought several scholars to wonder on the, obviously I would say, on the relations between the teaching of Abelard and the reforming vocation of Arnold that came close, especially in the moral requests and in the instruments of struggle, more to the Patarian tradition than to the Abelardian speculation, right? Arnold had this more kind of popular side, this more socially loaded, and Abelard was more of a thinker, was more of a philosopher, as a matter of fact. And it's also meaningful that these two areas had, for this reason, actually, this different orientations, especially at that at that moment. The Patarian movement was all around. It was in Lombardy, right, as well. So it's obvious that a native like Abelard would be, kind of influenced by that as well. And unfortunately, we can't answer this question because we lack the doctrinal elaborations of Arnold, right? And therefore we basically will never know. And even if it's reasonable to speculate that there was a strong sympathy from his side for the positions of the Parisian master, Parisian teacher. So the central nucleus of Arnold's ideology revolved around the concept that only through the renounce to earthly goods, right, the church could witness and safeguard the word of Christ. And in this sense, Arnold began to work, to operate in Brescia, where he had come back by 1119 and where he was ordered priest. And here he was posed at the head of a community of regular canons. So you see that this movement's actually spread. This is not this is born from within the same ecclesiastical society, community. Like this is important because it was the same clergy at this point that was still producing these elements, and because they had the intellectual means to have it. This guy had studied in Paris, right? These people were educated. They knew a lot, actually. They definitely knew how to read the Bible, to make an exegesis, to reflect, to confrontate its content with the other philosophical systems. So that's what these are not the common people that just want, the abolishment of property because, they are pressed by the canons of the local lord, because they have to pay every time. No, these are speculations that are essentially in between, right? Close to the socio-economical instances of the lower classes, but at the same time, also endowed with this, educational level that becomes the medium between the elite and the lower strata of the population. That's the junction where he said that the lower classes by themselves, they don't do anything structurally, and that's in fact what you need, someone who has studied to make that change, to spread these ideas. That's how it started. And so as Ariald, for example, in Milan, who is a Christian saint of the 11th century, was assassinated because of his efforts to reform the Milanese clergy. So even look at the parallelisms in here, that Arnold had done the same thing, essentially preaching as his principal instrument of action, incitated by the Brescian population to rise, at this point, however, against the Bishop Manfred. And for this work, he fell victim of censorship of Innocent the Second, right? That intimated him to leave Brescia and deprivating him of the preaching license. So at this point, Arnold came back to France, and it was on the side of Abelard during the Council of Sens in 1140, where, as we know, the Council of Sens, Abelard's doctrine was condemned as heretical, right? So this is very important. And at this point, Arnold was acquainted even with Saint Bernard, right? Whose implacable hostility actually would have, harassed him for the rest of his life. And when at Sens, Abelard's doctrine was condemned as heretic, Arnold remained next to his master, and for this reason, he was imposed perpetual silence within the walls of a monastery. And at this point, therefore, Arnold retired to Saint-Hilaire in Paris, where Abelard also had been. Albeit Arnold didn't cease to denounce the avarice of the clergy by propugnating as the unique instrument of redemption the renounce to each form of property. And depicted by Saint Bernard as a discord sower, Arnold didn't remain for a long time in his retirement at Saint-Hilaire, but prosecuting with his pilgrimage of exile, essentially, he went first to Zurich in Switzerland, and after a few years, in 1143, in Bohemia and Moravia, following the legation of the Cardinal Guido of Castello. But in fact, the familiarity with the pontifical legate had to yet reawake, let's say, the suspects of the indefatigable Bernard, that sent to Guido a letter in which he underlined the inopportunity, let's say better, to concess favors and trust to an individual whose danger had been demonstrated by the condemnation of, with the fact he had stood to the side of his heretical master. And yet, in spite of this influent pressure from Saint Bernard, the Cardinal Castello had to maintain with Arnold good relations. After all, this is quite interesting because you have eventually a pope that effectively would become important in this regard, and in fact it's thanks to the cardinal that actually Arnold's reconciliation with the Pope was possible, because in 1145 Arnold went to Viterbo near Rome and kneeled in sign of obedience at the feet of Pope Eugene III, who imposed him a penitential journey to Rome. But at that time, the same situation to Rome was such to actually relighten within Arnold the reforming vocation. And it's this climate of breaking, especially between the city and the pontiff, right, that will eventually trigger even the Raumfahrt of Frederick Barbarossa in Italy, and that popes like Innocent II and Lucius II had managed to contend, exploded exactly under exploded only under Eugene III, that eventually in fact decided preferred to leave Rome for Viterbo, where he had met Arnold. And the coming back in Rome of the Pope to let's say, next to which, the following of which, Arnold, the penitent Arnold, at this point was to be found, didn't happen in a better, kind of more serene political situation, since the Roman Senate at this point was heading fundamentally towards the expropriation of all the ecclesiastical property, with exception of the tithes and the offers. This is a dramatic episode in the history of Rome that, contrarily what is commonly believed, actually was a pretty active political center aside from the papacy itself. This is essentially where the Commune of Rome happened, and the Romans were extremely difficult to control, and the papacy was obliged to leave the city, and the local government was establishing essentially that the city control belonged to the Roman Senate. It was one of the old, this sense of awareness actually of the Roman city that still had even certain ambitions at that point within the universal powers, in the sense that the Roman Senate's acclamation was necessary, for example, for the imperial crowning formally, in the form, let's say, in the rite, and therefore eventually Frederick I would come back and would kind of put the situation in order once again. But let's say that the idea that the commune here, as a lay power, as a secular power, wanted to get rid of the earthly power of the church is quite meaningful as well, and that you understand why Arnold was attracted by this as well, because it's essentially what the older and kind of more orthodox view of what should pertain to the church and what to the seculum, what to the to the secular power was had traditionally been. So don't think, in fact, at this point in history, like, the struggle for investitures is over, so everything, it's not actually over. It won't be over, but let's say the first phase is over with the Concordat of Worms, and hence, the papacy is to live happy ever after. It didn't happen like that. There were these traumatic situations that, you understand, were destabilizing the same papal authority, right? That had a continuity, and we know it had, but at the time was evidently still a matter of debate by such powerful entities as the Roman aristocracy itself, the secular Roman aristocracy. And in fact, it's these political dynamics of kind of proto-communal, but not communal character proper, pushed Arnold towards a direct commitment within them, and he, in fact, is found to be, seriously, part of the disorders in Rome, together with a group of Lombard followers. And it's through the employment of instruments that had been proper of the Patarian tradition, that is, the lay use in preaching and the refusal of the sacraments, that Arnold managed to carry out, to enact its own reform, to lead the church, deprived of every temporal power, to his evangelical mission. And just think of what this means. Like, the Pope effectively overthrown from Rome, the local aristocracy confiscating all ecclesiastical property that in Rome was huge, in the sense that everything theoretically belonged to the church, and these instances of religious reformation that were bringing to the original state of a condition of the church, and the separation between the secular and ecclesiastical affairs, all in this optic of purification of same clergy, and the idea that everything had to be reverted to the original evangelical poverty. And it's at this point the evolution of the Roman political events that was pretty unstable anyway, that brings Arnold to his fall, because actually the attempt of the construction of a commune in Rome failed, and this brought Arnold and his Lombards to actually turn directly to Frederick Barbarossa in this moment that was about to, in fact, to come to Italy in 1152 for his crowning. Right, thinking all the matter here that the Holy Roman Emperor was I mean the king of the Romans still, because he had not been crowned in Rome, was looking at this, because this was an enormously important opportunity to kind of to determine here the weakening same of the papacy, from which the empire had kind of emerged badly in the previous generation, and that could favor, in fact, the centralization of imperial power that was seeking to revive Roman law, thanks to the same northern Italian studies and lawyers that were essentially pushing in that direction. Roman law excluded the papacy as a measure, like an agent, an actor of validation of imperial power. So the Hohenstaufen were absolutely quite careful what was going on. But this actually was reversed at the same time, because, and this brought to the end of Arnold himself, because Rome was excommunicated. This time by the new Pope Adrian IV, that actually posed as a condition for the revocation of the interdict the expulsion of Arnold himself. So this tells you how important Arnold had become in Rome for this during this period, and how central to the matter was. This wasn't just a matter of ecclesiastical reformation; it was a deeply political affair, right? And the Senate of Rome actually expelled Arnold from the city, and Arnold reached San Quirico Dolce in Tuscany, where he was actually captured and consigned to Frederick Barbarossa, who at this time, needing actually the backing of the papacy for the crowning, right, didn't hesitate, however, to become his carnifex, essentially. And so Arnold was killed, and he was burned at the stake, and his ashes were dispersed in the Tiber River, which was essentially an agreement, like it became the proof, the sanctioning of the alliance between the powerful, within which were the requests of renewal that had emerged from the base of Christian society were essentially strangled, right, in this way. So this story is so dramatic and complicated, telling the truth, but Arnold appears to be this acme of reforming radicalism of Patarian tradition that had animated the religious movements in the urban areas of the 11th century, and that finds in this context of religious dissent of the 12th, next to other heresiarchs that acted in different and far geographical contexts, such as in Provence, Peter of Bruy, or Henry the monk, his disciple, let's say, or the Flemish Tankelm, or the extravagant Eon de l'Etoile, all names that would have ended up in the long lists of doctrines and heterodox movements of the later pontifical bulls against heresy. And the interesting thing about Arnold from Brescia is that, aside from the elements that he used to be backed by, he himself didn't actually express any heterodox doctrinal position. This is important. Other think about Peter Waldo, for example, he would do that. Then they were changing really significant aspects. Here, Arnold from Brescia wasn't contexting actually anything doctrinal, but really claiming the usual form of purification of the clergy and abolition of property that was not formally against the Roman doctrine itself. So this different experiences that we have observed now, even with other heresies and heterodox movements, weren't actually similar. They can't be brought together doctrinally speaking. This is important, really, but rather by a common moral, right? That stemmed from this textual interpretation of the gospel, through which the deep need for a concrete recovery of the apostolic example was expressed in function of an instauration of a poor church, right? A poor church that had to be austere and penitent, right? And that we don't realize what it should have been like, actually, because at that point, you confiscate literally everything about it. What is that remains of the church proper? You make it remain sort of another pauperistic evangelical movement, nothing else. So this need actually often took the aspect of organized violence against ecclesiastical buildings, for example. The word symbol of power and riches of the church. Think that palaces, for example, were still fairly rare by certain standards. I mean, that was the symbol of secular power by definition. The palace, the palatium, that was the imperial symbol, the royal symbol, and it was the church was being clothed with. Organized violence was enacted also against the concubinary clergymen and also those who were guilty of simony, and also who had, for example, mismanaged the tithes for the poor, right? So there were naturally certain abuses and corruption and injustice and all what you can imagine, but this thing took the form of actually armed violence, something that would actually kill people and disrupt these hierarchies, in part, locally speaking. So this common moral direction, let's say, in belief and practices, were accompanied sometimes by a doctrinal awareness, right? That was always derived from an exasperated exegesis of the Gospels. It wasn't like a limpid, clear approach. It was, right, very, very radical in its concept. It inspired forms of refusal of many cultural practices, such and cultural and sacramental practices, from baptism of the children to the cult of the cross, that was identified like the infamous scaffold, and as such refused as an object of cult, right? This is very similar to the same certain Cather instances, for example, the Bogomilists, etc. All these movements is essentially Neoplatonic and Manichaean inspiration, we could say. But also the prayers for the dead and the more serious refusal, this disowning of the charismatic content of the Eucharist or of the same sacrifice of the Mass. So you understand that these movements were really like something that was touching, like some of the core elements that at this point had nothing to do with the organization of the church as such. I mean, it's obvious that the sacraments had become fundamentally like the appanage of the clergy. This control was of the Christians passed, Christian society passed also through this cults and liturgies. But the point is, the majority of people were absolutely fine with this, and they probably would neither understand why this was going on. It was an excuse. It was essentially proclaiming through the evidence of a radical interpretation of the scriptures that the Roman Church was wrong at this point. The clergy was or better, the Papacy, the current Pope, and its hierarchy was inept, was unworthy of the office, and that all society needed to be subverted about it. But even if you were a regular peasant who paid its own canon to the Lord and broke your back every day, but what the hell did you care about this objectively? Like, of course, maybe you could be oppressed at the point you would say, okay, nuts, and join these guys. But let's be honest, this was something more. It was driven by elements of society that had further interest, that we'll see better in the case of southern France, for example. But there were large dynamics in debate. Even they were based on actual local identities and needs for emancipation, political emancipation, that naturally the elites that were largely the secular elites were largely cooperating with the ecclesiastical ones didn't want to know anything about. So it's that intertwined, right? And this was the great mistake, however, of these movements, is that they were attacking, however, certain aspects of cult and liturgy, especially the one relative to the Eucharist, that were rooted in the deep substrata of popular religiosity. So you could play on many levels, like to convince that the clergy had to be reformed, etc., but not touching these elements. This was what defined a Christian at the time. So you wonder why these movements failed. Because they were rigged. Like, they couldn't go on like this. And that's why the heretics were actually very unpopular. This is another thing that is often overlooked, is that, yeah, maybe there could be a massive movement in a certain area that would, spread, attract sympathy from the local population, but the rest of the Christians in Europe would look at these, like other popular classes, and say, what the hell are these guys doing? And we've made the example of the Valdensians before, that offered their help to actually go there and repress the Cathars to the Roman Church, even if they were disagreeing with many aspects. So they dug their own grave, substantially. And there is this great reaction of intolerance as well from the side of crowds against what has been defined as an expropriation of the patrimony of salvific practices that the church had elaborated through a long cultural construction that belonged now to the Western Christian identity, and that at this point these guys were, completely wrong in, pretending to eradicate from the populace and to obtain results. So actually there were violent clashes against these heretics, even because many of them weren't actually even about religion. They did this just for robbing and sacking, and that's fundamentally it. We know it. This is the century of the Brabançons. This is the century of the great increase of mercenarism, of wars and violence and major devastations, to which also certain groups participated just to benefit out from the disorder. So it's no wonder that there was an establishment that needed to put an end to this, because what the hell? And the rest of the population agreed to and backed them as well. But when we look, on the other hand, at spiritual experiences like the one of Arnold, and the preaching of a message that, even if in a non-conformistic way, was based on actual canonic text of Christian tradition, there was a benefit overall, right? For example, this contributed as a spin-off to write in vernacular the Holy Scriptures. The curiosity for the Gospels was spread everywhere at this point. This was this action of itinerant preachers was the principal mean of propagation of this interests and intellectual commitment that actually had a greater fortune north of the Alps rather than in Italy, and where the gap that the absenteeism of the secular clergy was fundamentally more marked and filled, however, in this way. So with the first Crusader expeditions, there was also this new wave of pilgrimage in the Holy Land that, on the other, in turn, let's say, fueled the desire to know through the direct contact with the holy places, the evangelical episodes, like the ever more explicit will to conform with these examples. And it's exactly in this context that we have to locate the spread of the apocryphal Gospels, for example, with which were, let's say, filled certain narrative gaps that the synoptic Gospels had, especially in relation to the childhood of Jesus and of the story of the Virgin. And a corollary of this renewed impulse was the better understanding of the sacred texts. Doesn't matter whether they were canonical or apocryphal. And this was a tendency that, for example, is probably greatest expression in Saint Bernard, to conceive Christ not anymore with the kingly characters of the sovereign judge, as for example, the Byzantine iconography had codified in the Pantocrator, but in the suffering and painful nature of the cross, of the crucifix. And starting from this period, the cultural themes related to the humanity of Christ, in fact, would have spread from the Cistercian centers to meet this enormous religious success that would have deeply modified the devotional sensitivity in the following centuries. And that's how, when the representations of passion, the mystics, and the spirituality already of the end of the 12th, but principally over the 13th and 14th century, would have given life to this praxis, ascetical practices of the imitatio Christi, right? And this complex need to realistically and rationally relate, but also effectively and emotionally relate to the origins, was concretized, therefore, in a critical religious line that had to be, in fact, revived a few decades later by one of the most radical Pauperistic evangelical movements of the 13th century. And that's in this picture that was essentially standing out the most fearsome among the threats to the religious hegemony of the Roman Catholicism, that was the Cather Heresy. So the episode of Arnold of Brescia is actually very thought-provoking, because it's one of the experiments that went the closest to achieve an actual political change, not much, I would say, within the church itself, but in those who were trying to stem the same power of the church. In that case, specifically the Roman commune, but also the Roman emperor, that, however, realized at one point, when also the Roman Senate had forsaken Arnold, that it was better to side from the side of the papacy, because by the way, the that situation might have been exploited differently, but let's say the major change of this ecclesiastical order would have caused many aftershocks, probably also in the rest of the elites. It would have caused less order in a world that was seeking for it, like it was seeking order, and that in this dual balance between the papacy and the empire actually found it in part because it was either just being part of the one or the other, really meant to be like, having a bipolar, political picture, which is dramatically useful because it's either one or the other, right? It was never like this actually in medieval Europe, but it would have surely been better than simply saying at that point in the 12th century, okay, let's essentially create all different churches on our own, and let's simply let be this empire that, however, at that point would have lacked legitimization, at least through the traditional forms that can't even control, a half of Europe, and that is Western Europe, by the way, and that can't, at that point, from which every secular power could have taken away part, because would had controlled that anymore. It would have been an anarchical model that would have created enormous problems also at the same level of jurisdiction. Like at that point we would have essentially tried to stem a political line. Right, the church had this role, had this beneficial role of saying, okay, yes, we do our own business, but at the same time we tend to give an order to this. We tend to build a model that in turn actually not only strengthened the church, but that presented an imitation model even for the lay powers, like the powers like France, like the other. Think about the same creation of the Kingdom of Sicily was a papal creation, for example. Even the Angevin kingdom eventually. Those worked together with the papacy, together with its own bureaucracy, its own written culture, its own massive juridical production. I mean, this was really the cradle of Western civilization in many ways. Like, medieval civilization passes through this incredibly well. So I think that this order was, at the end of the day, beneficial to the overall equilibrium of medieval Europe. It allowed it to essentially regulate a balance that stabilized the continent after all, and give it an order that would be very important for the same, even for the development of what we call human rights now, that essentially emerged from this constant dialectics existing by the secular authority, ecclesiastical ones, right? So everything was that, if one of, like, the church had not represented a counterweight to imperial authority, this effective separation between state and church could have not happened. I don't know if you ever thought about this. Now we see it as a weakness, like saying, this empire couldn't even control the church, right? It was, in my opinion, a positive thing. Like, you can't say in 12th century Italy, for example, what the struggle for investitures actually triggered in terms of juridical production. Then you wonder why the first universities were in there, and why this thing remained hegemonic for half of Europe for centuries and centuries. Because this struggle created civilization as a spin-off. There was an enormous need for juridical research, for philology, for account. Like, it was an empire to regulate. And this passed through the church, and we have to thank what happened in there, because largely, great part of Western achievements owe so much to what was accomplished by the Roman Curia in this way. Whereas, what were these movements actually achieving, if not further destabilization? I'm really convinced at this point in my life that this was a real success, of course, of the church, as we know, eventually on the longer run, in the longer perspective, but it was a massive achievement of the same Western civilization as a whole to produce the Roman papacy in its monarchical form, and to organize Christianity the way it did. Eventually to create, of course, like, I sound probably very biased when I talk about this in these terms, because there is an enormous realization historiographically about, the fact that these other forms of living religion, of spirituality, were erased, right? And we often think, like, especially of the heretical movements, but thinking about also those other beliefs that actually survived in Europe even from pre-Christian times. But the point is that, not often, like, it's not that having freedom is necessarily a precondition to actually make good use of it. And it sounds horrible, devastating, because to me freedom is objectively something. But, for example, we established in Western civilization a pretty marked separation between what is freedom, meant negatively speaking, we can say, and liberty. Right, you can't do every single thing, because if you love freedom so much, you could even take a shotgun and start shooting, blowing people's brains out in the street. That you're free to do that. That's not freedom. I mean, that's not the freedom we think of, but it's like more of a negative view of it. Like, you can do whatever you like. Well, human societies do not function like this. I mean, all these fringes tried to make it function in a different way, and they were all crushed. Like, this is one of the things that history has taught to us, is that all extremistic fringes, sometimes, a part of them have surely contributed to create something different. Think about the revolutions, etc. But we have explained today as well what effectively the contribution of the elites and the middle classes was in that regard. But eventually the extremistic fringes get wiped out. They're used as long as they can make something work, then eventually they're eliminated. That's the destiny of extremistic fringes, to be taken out, because once the changes has occurred, you don't need them anymore. On the contrary, they're kind of annoying. And it's even positive to get rid of them, but they're always there. Like, society also functions in a way that these always re-emerge, exactly to keep the balance alive of the orthodoxy, of the greater power, of the greater establishment, right? So that's this is where things get controversial, right? I would like to spend more time on this topic because I think it's actually very important from many points of view, but I think that at the same time there is, let's say, many mistakes are done because we don't look at history and realize what even certain movements were really about. We need to mask them, to clothe them with, like, these precursors of free thinking. These people were not free thinkers. They were not by definition. They were some of the most radical and dogmatic among these communities that existed. They had nothing to do with free thinking. They had to do with a thinking that would have imposed only what they wanted, right? In a kind of an exclusivistic way. And at that point, they would have grown intolerant as much as the orthodoxy was doing. That instead, at a certain point, made this great work of civilization, even of absorbing part of these movements, the least violent, the least radicalized, with success, because such orders still exist today in the Catholic Church, for example. So, yeah, these things are important to remember, in my opinion. Alright, so I think for today we stop here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.